Welcome to the Digible Dudes podcast. I'm David.
I'm Reid.
I don't know, Reid, Nat, we were doing Fridays. Now we're doing Monday midday after lunch. I did just eat a 12-inch snarf sandwich, so
That was impressive. I didn't think you were going to get that whole thing down. I should never doubt you, though.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the best. At least it wasn't Moe's barbecue or anything, but I just don't know how my energy level will be throughout.
We'll see whether like that volume of carbohydrates, what it does to you, or the volume of protein. You know, which one you're theoretically you should be more up for it after the carbs.
Yeah,
protein should be the one more that sends you into some sort of food coma.
Yeah.
Although, after those carbs start to fade out, you may fade out as well. So we better hustle on this podcast.
Yeah, let's see if I can keep the energy level up. So today there was an announcement just about a week ago with RealPage acquiring G5, and we've been hit by a number of people that wanted to hear our take on it. Just frankly, because they're probably our closest competitor, or what we see as the closest competitor, although we don't often think of them as a competitor. Like, we feel like, at least I'll give my impression, like we kind of attack a slightly separate space, but we do have a lot of customers that have either G5 advertising or Digible or both, and there's a lot of like jumping back and forth between the two. It's just because we do provide there is some overlap, but they certainly do things that we don't, like some of the creative services, some of the websites and stuff, and we have our own niche. So
for the time being.
Yeah, for the time.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. So I guess, like, what was your first impression when you saw it come across the wire? I don't know, the end of July.
Well, I was shocked, and almost entirely because of the Lease Labs acquisition just a few years ago. I guess that was in 2018, I think. RealPage grabbed them, so I just didn't anticipate, I guess, that they would stack these two together. It just that's the main thing. I mean, I'm not surprised by a large company or one that's had a raise as recently as they had, finding their way to an exit. But the other part of it, I guess, is a little bit surprising is that they have these other categories, and granted they're tangential, meaning G5. They have senior living, they have self storage. But it seemed as though RealPage was entirely focused on real estate. But if you look at that just a little bit more broadly, then I guess you could squeeze these in. And maybe, I think I said that to our friends over there at Real Foundation, David, Stanford, but that this is a sign of things to come maybe for RealPage, is that they are going to look at some secondary markets as part of this acquisition. And it was fascinating, and not to randomly squeeze in Appfolio into this, but when you and I met with them a few years ago, they had talked about their roadmap, and that was one of the things they were looking to do, was take their software, translate it into other verticals, and do one. I think they told us one per year or something pretty ambitious, but they never got past really real estate, and then I guess they were doing some stuff with law. So I'm just putting that in there because anytime I see something like this, and even last week or 2 weeks ago when we talked about Entrada, I brought that up too. Like, is this a sign that they might be looking outside of real estate? But yeah, that was my initial reaction. The biggest shock was the Lease Labs coming just a few years before.
Yeah, I didn't think with Lease Labs that they would do it. It's funny because I've talked to a number of clients now, and they aren't shocked. And I think they aren't shocked because, we've only been in this space kind of, I guess, going on 6 years, and they're just used to RealPage buying everyone up. Mm-hmm. In fact, thought this was a fun fact, but take a guess at how many acquisitions RealPage has made now up to this point.
Well, can you give me, not a hint, but give me a timeline of like RealPage? So are we talking last 30 years, last 10, last 20?
Yeah, I was going to give you since they went public. So it looks like they went public in 2011.
So you're asking since they've gone public, how many have they bought?
Mm-hmm.
15?
42. Just a smidge, just a little bit off on that one.
I was feeling decent about that.
I know. I was like, if I gave a hint double digits, I would have thought like kind of what you said, just about maybe a dozen or 15, because it's like a dozen sounds like a lot, or feels like a lot, or can, particularly since 2011, because it's only been 10 years. But to do 42, that means you're buying four companies a year on average. So it's like even in 2020, so they had a slow year in 2020. They bought two companies. In 19, they bought four. And in 21 so far, they've bought two. So they're but some of these are definitely out of our wheelhouse, I guess, or our scope, and so it's not on our radar. But I just couldn't believe how much. What's really interesting is when they went public, they were their market cap was only like 800 million, and now, as we saw just earlier, when they got bought by private equity, it was 10.2 billion. So I don't know this, but it would be interesting to see how much of this growth is the 42 acquisitions, meaning the improvement in their overall valuation versus like their actual growth. So yeah, that blew me away.
Well, I guess it does tell you that model, I don't know if it always works, but it certainly can work. And we won't name names, but there's a firm or fund that approached us that had that same proposition. And I saw actually in the letter from the CEO on G5 that he said at the bottom of that he personally had spent or was investing in the new company, meaning he's betting on the bigger outcome or bigger picture. And you and I are, I don't want to say both skeptical or equally skeptical of that model, but it just almost feels like a Ponzi scheme where it's like you get into these companies, it's like, oh, just trust us. There's going to be a new crop. We're just going to keep buying and we're going to keep, delivering back that multiplier. But hard to argue, right? With the 800 million now at a $10 million market cap.
10 billion, yeah. With G5, I didn't think they would go there because of lease labs. So as you said, like a lot of it is service. A lot of G5's revenue is service based. A lot of lease labs revenue is service based. Now both of them have their own, we'll call it tech platforms, right? So like lease labs had their website CMS, and G5 has their CMS reporting sort of recommendation engine, but it's not even near like close to 10% of the revenue that makes that part up. And of course, it was private, so we don't know all the numbers, but I have some figures. So I just want to quickly hit on the moving and storage side of things. I don't know that RealPage cares about that. I feel like this is more of like, let's get all the players, let's buy every big player, as they like to do, keep this industry like contained, and then sure, we'll take the moving and storage business, but it's really just service revenue and maybe some like website play. And then that you can amortize that over a long period because, you can just leave the lights on, if you will, keep the revenue. Now, they probably like the revenue because it helps, RealPage's overall valuation. But I'm wondering how much credit they really gave to that with the acquisition price, which was undisclosed. So we don't know how much it was worth. But the last time G5 raised money, it was in 2015?
Yeah, 76.
Yeah, and they raised 76 million, and the estimated valuation at that point was just over 300 million. So you got to imagine since 2015, they must have grown past the 300 million valuation because it wasn't the landscape back then wasn't nearly as frothy as it is now with investment dollars. But I don't know how much more you would have gotten. I feel like this is almost like the Moz, like Rand Fishkin with Lost and Founder with it, because like they originally G5 was raised 15 million from venture capitalists. Then that second round, which is the last round they took, was the 76, but that was from private equity. So I feel like once you move from venture to private equity, you've kind of given up on that, like started to give up on that moonshot. Then we know them primarily as this like service revenue. And then, so then if you get bought, like, and their estimated revenue is beneath 50 million, which could definitely be off, but it, on service revenue to get, even if you had $100 million to get over a 300 million valuation would be pretty rough. Would be pretty kind of like at the best case scenario.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that is the question I have in both of those deals. And you and I talked a little about this, of course, offline, but we can bring it on to into this conversation, but is how much value is put on websites. It just seems silly to me, but you said it. It's like looking at their quote unquote, your air quotes, tech platform. There isn't really much of one, although it seems to me that G5 is a little bit further out in front as far as their own recommendation engine than Lease Labs, which came a little bit after our own. But we're already discovering, and not that this couldn't turn into something, I guess bigger, but that this industry isn't really necessarily ready for a self-serve platform when it comes to marketing. And hopefully that changes over time. But I only bring that up because, again, that would tell you there's not that much money tied to that tech. And so then it is websites and running search campaigns and social and stuff. So I guess we should be encouraged, not that this, as we've said several times, is our intent, but that these kinds of valuations are happening, with predominantly service revenue. But it's definitely a surprise.
Yeah, and I was just trying to check the difference in website volume, but like Lease Labs had an estimated, let's say 3,000 like websites that they were doing work on when they got acquired for that 100 million. And I don't have the number directly in front of me, but I feel like the number I saw for G5 was something like, oh shoot, now I'll find the number. But it wasn't like 4 times as much as far as the number of units that they were touching. So then if you could almost back into the valuation if you want to consider customers, because part of the thought process with Lease Labs that we heard was that a lot of that was because of how many customers that they had that RealPage didn't have, and so it was a way for RealPage to get hooks in on some of those folks. So if you take the same approach, because we thought Lease Labs is over, well, it was very generous of a valuation. It was like they were 16 million in revenue,
like 6.5x or something.
Yeah,
6 to 7.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, some of that is like it's a big number, but depending how RealPage structures the deal on, how much is what thresholds you have to hit and stuff, they may not have nearly had to pay all 100 million just from these targets. So I imagine though G5, with their backers compared to Lease Labs didn't have other backers. G5 you would think would have worked a pretty sophisticated deal. So they may have protected against some of that, some of those targets that would have prevented them from getting the whole amount.
Yeah. Well, back to websites briefly, it just seems so easy to change websites. So it wasn't the case years ago. I feel like there was a lot more switch costs or concern, about abandoning your current, web host or developer. But these days they make that so seamless. And I'm not saying there's no pain involved, but that's part of, again, why I'm scratching my head. It's like, is that really all that valuable? I think what people are all looking for now, I mean, we certainly appreciate this, is like to be open source or have flexibility with your website where you can integrate, talk to all these other technologies that are hitting, right? Whereas that's the opposite model for Lease Labs and for G5. As much as I understand, is they don't like playing with anybody else. They're trying to keep you on their stack, which is counter to the real macro trend going on, which is like you need those universal adapters like within your technology. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself super frustrated being limited really to one provider. So I just feel like the bigger trend here is pointing a different direction than where G5 is trying to keep it. And that's only from what I've heard.
Yeah. And yeah, confirming my number, G5 reportedly had 8,300 customers. So it'd be 2.5 times what Lease Labs had at sale. So if you took, let's just round it to 100 million, down a little bit for Lease Labs, that'd just be, if that was the number, that would be 250 million, which would have been down from 2015. So you would think that G5 would have hopefully gotten more unless they saw the sort of like Moz local, like writing on the wall. So I'm with you. Those stacks and the proprietary stuff, it's like I feel like you have to choose one or the other. Either you have to go AppFolio where you're all in, it's like only our stuff, or you have to be universal. But the RealPage, G5, and Lease Labs all kind of played in the middle, where it was like, look, we really are going to be kind of crappy to you if you try to not use our stack. We're going to really try to push you to use our stack, but we will eventually relent if you decide to bring some other stuff together. So I guess it's like, why would I then say you have to?
Mm-hmm.
But I just feel like for the customer experience, both your B2B customer and then the B2C customer, it's like you got to choose one way or the other. But when you do this like halfway in between, it does not equal a great customer experience for your B2B customers, so the property management companies, where things are constantly broken or not integrating properly or whatever, or you're the B2C customer where, again, it's like, how come I can't schedule this here? I thought I booked that appointment and you don't see me in the system. What's going on? So that's why I say you need to choose, because of that whole the customer experience side of things.
Totally. Well, I mean, it's certainly not, I forget what he put it for the G5's vision, or what that vision statement was, but certainly RealPage it's less of, well, they're all about the data. Like that's what I've taken, if there's any common denominator to like those acquisitions, and I don't know, obviously all 42, but that's their ultimate like mission here, is to control and own the data in the industry, which I think is super smart. The more that they get, they will kind of force that, adoption with the industry. It's interesting though, because we talked recently, I think it was to Blanton Turner about this, one of our clients out in Seattle, how much they appreciate that they weren't having to use the full stack. And I think this was related to syndication, that RealPage actually did chop up their products, which surprised me a little bit. I didn't think that was their model, but I'm curious as they get further into this with Lease Labs, with G5, and I guess anybody else that they have on their radar, if they're going to maintain that, where it's like you can go a la carte with us, or if they're going to start to shift. I don't know if it would be back or into more of a, you got to use our full suite, kind of an Adobe or Microsoft Office type approach. Obviously, this is like super pertinent for us because we're thinking through this ourselves, and we want to maintain being a universal adapter. But there is, the power and the value of going to market with a suite.
Yeah. I guess at least as long as if you build it to be a universal adapter, hopefully that client experience is well thought out and It's not so haphazard. The problem is how many integrations there have to be to start being the universal adapter. Totally. Let's take a little bit of a different spin, but what's the bull case on this, or the positive scenario of the acquisition?
Well, I think, it's kind of like, I don't know, cable providers. It's like, I've been on both sides of this. Meaning as a consumer, where it's like, I prefer not to have all the options. I'd prefer, things to be consolidated. And we talk about this with the ILS all the time. Like, is it good or bad? There's been so much consolidation. And when I've talked to a lot of our clients, they're not happy about whoever that gorilla is, but they are happy about the fact that they don't have to think about 20 different options. And so I would think there's some peace of mind or goodness that comes out of that for folks that are in the industry trying to find marketing solutions, where it's like, but it's hard for me not to make the counter argument, but I would think that would be it, is, just some consolidation can be a good thing for an industry.
Yeah, I would say, one, I agree with you that, particularly if they integrate well. So one of the issues we've seen is that RealPage, Lease Labs, we've heard, is still not fully integrated into RealPage. It's just when you have such a big ship, and now that we're looking at, if you're making 4 acquisitions a year, how can you possibly integrate? I mean, we've been around so long, and there's still some of our database that the data team has that the services side doesn't have. And, we're just not the same, size of organization. But I would also say the positive would be, we remember in 2020, before the pandemic hit, that venture capital moving into prop tech was higher than it had ever been, and it looked like it was on the rise. And it slowed a little bit, but was still overall higher than most years in 2020. So I'd say that things like this help signal to outside investors that, hey, this market is still worth pursuing. And maybe so I could see some new blood coming into the space with some new dollars to help push things along. And so I'd say, as long as you keep having one sort of what feels like a small group of winners that own the market, then I think you're going to get a lot of these venture capitalists that want to come in and help disrupt the market. So I'd say that is good for the innovation side of things. And then, it could be good if RealPage does integrate this well. So it could be good for clients to have the whole stack together. It seems like that's actually a tall order. I don't envy the position. That's a lot to try to integrate, particularly now that you probably have I bet you still have. In fact, I know some Lease Labs people that are at RealPage, and they've been there before the acquisition, now with the acquisition, and they're probably just feeling like they're getting their feet wet, and then G5 comes in, their new shiny object, right? And so then it's shoot, you're going to have some infighting.
Totally. So. Yep. And all that cultural discord. I think the other benefit is the data, that we were kind of, or I was starting to talk about with RealPage's real focus is, all this technology, more so I'll say the AI, the algorithms are predicated on data, right? Like big data. And so if the data is disparate, and you've talked about this a lot, and, love your idea about standardizing the marketing terms and data and all that. But if there's more consolidation, that's more likely to happen, versus if you have all these different digital marketing platforms and companies that are all calling stuff separate, terms, naming conventions, keeping their data separated so there isn't the bigger cooperative, then how effective can these algorithms really be, which is ultimately what it's all about. It's like everybody's just looking to have max performance for their investment. And so, from that standpoint, that's also, I guess, a good thing.
Yeah, it's almost like what will probably happen here, and you've seen this story 100 times from acquisitions that happen, but the first, as G5 gets acquired, then innovation for that organization will start to halt because all of the resources go to like trying to integrate and handle those types of things. So that'll stunt the industry a little bit, but then that helps bring others in because others see the opportunity from the acquisition that then they start to help like bring innovation back into the industry. So it could be that 10 years from now this helps, but generally in large organizations like this, particularly when it's this whole roll-up strategy, it's hard to keep that innovation going. So those big companies, it's your whole buy or build, but they end up buying instead of building. So I'd say, I guess it's just going to be good for more startups. So unfortunately, I think that'll means it'll limit things for now, unless there's some market change when it comes to the data side of things, where all of a sudden, I don't know, RealPage is able to provide your data seamlessly, but that seems like not as likely because of the integration issues.
Well, as I was saying about Entrata, and two very different reputations between Entrata and RealPage, but I'm trying to make this comparison more between Entrata and G5. But I'll be curious to see, what their reputation like, or how it's affected, if it's affected at all. I mean, usually, there's all sorts of conjecture and hype, I guess, like when these things first take root, or when they first take place. But then once they actually take root, what is the outcome to the end consumer, or customer, I should say. So as you said, we have plenty of people that we know that have part of their services or some stacks like through these guys. So we'll definitely be close to it and be getting some firsthand feedback on how they feel about things as they get further into it.
Yeah. Well, we'll do this. We won't do a whole nother episode on this next one. Otherwise, we'd make it. It's like this podcast would change to like an acquisition podcast. But I just told you right before we started was Sochi purchasing Brandify, announcing that. And it's just, that's again, one more thing in the space. So Sochi isn't as dedicated to apartments as G5 was. Although what's interesting, backing up on G5 for a second, when I used Rand Fishkin's new tool, so he left Moz to start Spark Toro, which you can then look at what types of people are following companies or vice versa. And it was saying that most of the chatter around G5 was actually in the moving and storage space. So if you looked at like the types of folks on LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook that were following and engaging with G5 is primarily the moving and storage. I didn't see anybody from his tool that was related to property management or apartments.
Wow.
So I wonder if they were actually a bigger business or not on the moving storage side. Also, when I went to, was it Super Bowl or the Olympics? Whatever, one of those trips that Google sent me on, the G5 rep that I was with, he was like, oh, I don't know anything about apartments. He's like, all I do is moving and storage. And I was like, at the time, that was kind of like blew my mind. I was like, I didn't know G5 even did moving and storage. Right. But it may have just been a bigger aspect of their business than we've considered. But Sochi is less dependent on just apartments, and certainly Brandify had quite a bit going on in apartments, but really Brandify was bigger outside of apartments. Like I think they did stuff for like Dick's Sporting Goods and Ace Hardware and
restaurants too, I thought.
Yeah.
Chains.
Yeah. So just thought that was a really interesting announcement. Again, like no price was discussed, but I also kept thinking of Sochi as an up and comer, and not which. Had raised a considerable bit of money, but I hadn't considered them like yet in the acquiring mood. And Brandify, we've known the team over there for a number of years, and they had been mostly bootstrapped. And they had even asked us if we wanted to take money at one point because the founders were privately investing in different companies. So I thought they were like all the angel route. So I actually need to reach out to some of our contacts over there and just pick their brain a little bit.
Yeah. Well, our main contact, I thought he moved on, but maybe we still have a few more that that are still there that we can reach out to, and we won't turn this into, although it's becoming that full-fledged acquisition podcast, but was Redfin buying RentPath, and I was surprised by that for a few reasons. I mean, we thought it was going to happen between CoStar and them, and then that unraveled. I still can't remember. I don't know if you can on whether that was, at the 11th hour they pulled out, or if it was interrupted some other way that kept that from happening. But then it's like, okay, this company that's filed for bankruptcy and just seems to be bleeding out, becoming obsolete, gets grabbed for an even higher valuation by Redfin. So they bought them for 600 million plus, and it was 500, it was $500 million that CoStar was going to grab them for. And again, I'm somewhat interested, like in just, I guess the numbers and the players, but I'm more interested in the outcome. Like once these things take place, what's the effect, to again end customer, but then of course like the industry at large. I don't know if you've heard anything. I haven't about RentPath doing anything different, other than dabbling right now in kind of our neck of the woods, which is in the service side. But why do you buy, a company like that for $600 million? What are you planning to do with it? So again, maybe this is more about the data, and just having customers, and that's where they really see the premium. But I guess I was expecting with that kind of money being poured back into RentPath, that we'd start seeing more innovation, some real.
I just heard that they were doing more on services. So I had heard that they were just like on some like crazy email kick, like emailing their customers like each week saying like, hey, we do services. And I was told the messaging is like, keep all your stuff in one place. I mean, you do stuff with us already, so move your services on over. And they've apparently come out with some, or part of their emails are hyping some new targeting services that they offer. I tried to get details on that, but the clients I talked to just didn't have. They were just like, I don't know, it just sounds exciting. And I was like, well, what do you mean? It's like they talk about their proprietary targeting. So I don't know what that entails. It's like with anything. It's like, does that just mean they're retargeting like RentPath users where they go elsewhere? And that's my assumption, which is kind of the Zillow Boost side of things. And if that's the case, it's like, well, then you got to consider, is the traffic that is on RentPath, is that similar to the traffic that you want for your property? And or is the way that because I think if we had the audience segment from RentPath, we'd be excited like to test it and see what we could do. But I'd want to be pixeling Class A properties and Class A properties. So it's like that way, if you're buying into their extended audience, it's based on other Class A, possible renters versus like, I don't want everybody in Seattle like to retarget those people because a lot of them may not matter. So if you could dig into it with your rep from RentPath, then maybe it'd be interesting. I don't know that means that they have any leg up though. Like as we saw, even when we were at the Post, like we could do stuff with like extend the audience, but we weren't really like mechanized for that. So you almost have to get into like, well, how else is this campaign built? Because that's a nice little sort of like chocolate sprinkle on top of the sundae, but like there's still the meat of the sundae that you have to worry about like how else are you running these campaigns? Like how many campaigns is each one of your CMs expected to manage? Yada yada. But so I almost view it as like this would be a cool audience segment if they sold it, but didn't use that as forced. But I don't know how much of the market really understands how that works and how many of them really. I think some customers just kind of believe like, oh, you run Google and they run Google. It's the same thing, right? Like you guys, it's all the same. It's like, well, everybody can make a grilled cheese sandwich, but some people charge $25 for that sandwich and some are more in the 75-cent range. So,
yeah. Well, I think you started to, what could be a really valuable component to RentPath, which would be their a DMP, effectively, right? Where they could do all sorts of different segmentation using first-party data. But what you also alluded to when we were at DFM was that it wasn't mechanized, but even had it been mechanized, we still were discovering that when you really drilled down past just one or two different segments, like that there wasn't much audience to actually go after. So while there's value there, and we ourselves with our EL90 product, deliver that, a lot of times we do run into those challenges. And also given the trends that, we all know are not just coming, but here around data privacy, restrictions on cookies, iOS 14, like there's just so many things that I think are unfortunately going to reduce value in this type of technology or space or provider. Another thing, and this would be maybe the one thing that I think could excite investors, is that there's so much automation now that a digital marketing service company back to tech enabled actually has opportunities to really grow their margin in a way that they never thought possible. I obviously was calling for not the end of, how funny would that be, right? But digital marketing agencies, but the traditional model, because margins were getting so compressed. It was like, it's all a commodity. We're all doing the same thing. As you just said, Google, you do Google, they do Google. And it's like, next thing you know, people are charging 5% management fees. So where's the business in that? But now there's this, I guess, new hope where it's like through scripts and automation, all these other things, you can actually really scale a service-based company with a ton of automation, which then feels like recurring revenue and has longevity to it. So I'm just, I guess, obviously talking out loud here, but just trying to think, what is the pitch? What excited them? Because I just can't buy. I really can't. That it's websites.
For
It's like,
Redfin.
why? Well, I'm Redfin, as well as RealPage, like what they've just done. But in both cases, like, because you see that RentPath's moving more towards services, like you said, they're starting to do that. We also know, not naming names, some of the people that we're talking to that are interested in expanding and getting into some of that larger deal size, which they, are finding through services. And so, how is that really exciting when that's such a congested space, an investor, a PE firm, venture, and I think, like I said, it must be because they're seeing a new opportunity starting to like kind of open up through automation that may say, hey, these service-based companies really can become tech enabled. We see good recurring revenue here, and the margins actually can improve versus what people were thinking just a few years ago.
Yeah, I think it could depend. So on the G5 side of things, I think the websites are part of it, because it's like, maybe you think, again, toehold, I've got the website, that means I can get my claws in on everything else. I think, though, also there are these, you used to say, Max quote about revenue solves everything. And so I think there is this thing when, particularly for these venture funded companies, or that traditionally have been, where they do think revenue solves everything. So they don't look as much at the margin on those, like, oh shoot, what is a good service revenue margin of like 6%? You're like crushing it, right? So then, so I don't think they're thinking about that. I think they're more of like, we need to keep showing revenue go up, because investors are still willing to invest in companies that aren't really profitable, as long as the revenue growth is there. But it's funny, because like, you'll remember Google, when they brought us out there a couple of years ago, they were saying that the traditional agency model was going away, and they had like 30,000 agency partners, and now they're reducing the number of agency partners that they're. In fact, they discontinued the Premier program, or not quite discontinued it, but might as well have. And the thought, Google's at the time 2 years ago was telling us it's all about that automation that you're saying, that tech-enabled service company. But yeah, I just don't know that. I don't think that's the business that somebody wants, like an ILS or a Redfin. I don't think a Redfin wants the service revenue to, like, that's not why you buy RentPath. I think you buy RentPath to show you're committed to the industry, and it's almost more like protection. Like, okay, I don't want Zillow's starting to get into rentals, or is in rentals, but is starting to be thought more of as a rental company, and then therefore, like, we need to buy it so that they don't buy it. So it's more of like just so they can't have it. But then maybe you use the service revenue, hoping like that can get you along until you find something better, because you used to say, even at the post, that you can't just go that way, because margins are so compressed and so competitive. There's got to be some sort of new innovation that comes up. So I think it's more that as a company,
are they betting on the come, because unless we just haven't heard about it, but they haven't found that new ingredient, I guess, or new revenue line, related to that. Well, certainly with RentPath, unless they think it's service, like I just said, which I don't think it is. But if you view it a little differently, and I hear you completely on, it's typically more on the top line, especially with the size of acquisitions. But that will catch up to you eventually. If you don't find that new revenue line, you could have made a big mistake.
Yeah. Well, I think some of the companies, some of the public ones and even private equity ones, they want the top line so they can keep raising money. So it's almost like, shoot, we need to show something so that we can raise money to, hopefully we find that golden whatever.
Golden goose.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, if RealPage came knocking to our door and said, here's a check for $150 million, would you take it?
Oh, RealPage? I mean, you know me, I'm pretty like against the sale. I love the MailChimp thing. I just started the book, Let My People Go Surfing, from the founder of Patagonia.
Yeah. That's
Man,
right.
you're going to be nauseated in the next couple of weeks about me talking about freaking Patagonia. So not right now. I think we're making too much of a difference.
I asked that more about RealPage than I did about, whether you're open to selling.
Yeah.
Because I know you're mostly against that. But as they say, and I think it's fair for most people, there's a number. There's always a number. That's why I said 150. So if I told you 500 million, I'm getting more at like, how much, would you fight that urge with a RealPage versus like, and I don't know who to bring up.
Yeah. I definitely think I would fight it. I think I would definitely fight it more for RealPage than anybody else, but that's mostly because they don't have the most glowing reputation of those that they acquire. Like the folks, when they acquire folks, the people we know have not stuck around. And so it's not like they're like, you know what, actually the stories aren't true.
Yeah, I've never heard that. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing that's funny and it's not, is we constantly are hearing people telling us, don't ever sell out to RealPage. And some of those people have now sold out to RealPage.
Yeah, I know.
It's like, I know. And it just gets into the economics. But you have to say, it's like, as Steve Donahue's told us, it's like generational wealth is something you do have to stop and think about.
Yeah. Well, that's what's fun about this Patagonia book, but he talks about like they were offered like over $100 million in 1991 or something for the company. And they had not really yet been profitable, or they were, but it was like barely scraping by. He was like, from when they went from $2 million to $100 million in revenue, he's like, him and his wife, who both worked at the company, had the same living, like that, barely scraping by, like, going camping trips and like living on dollars for the day or whatever. And he talks about like how he had this, one of their board members had come to them and said, hey, you should really take this offer because you've decided your mission and vision is all about like helping the environment and reinvesting and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, so if you cashed out for 100 million, you could do a lot more good with that. And in fact, you could probably put in the terms that the new acquirer keeps doing a small stipend each year to the same causes because it's a good marketing play and blah, blah, blah. And then he says in the book, he's like, boy, am I glad I didn't do that. He's like, because they've now given away like $67 million so far. And he's like, and he would have lost it all in the like stock market crash of like the year 2001 or 2008. He's like, because you make an endowment or something, and then your fund just tries to live off the stock market. So he's like, there's 2 crashes since then. Now, just one last thing on that I'll say, but it's really interesting because at Patagonia he's now put in this. They give away either 10% or 10% of profits or 1% of revenue, whichever is higher. So if they have a year that they're not profitable, they give away 1% of revenue to different grassroots causes.
Very cool.
So I just think it's a really great model to show how you can sort of like buck the trend. I think the RealPage would be like try to avoid it, but at some point, if you're like super overvalued, you're like, well, could I do more with this? Sooner, make an impact sooner than
right.
And there's something you can also do something different with that, as long as there's not like a non-compete stipulation or something. But you could take it and reinvest and do it all over, as we've seen like Robert from BetterBot. Like he's exited a few times and he just jumps right back in the game. So yeah, I guess.
All right.
Well, anyways,
there you have it.
Hopefully there's no more acquisitions in the next couple of weeks so we can get on with whatever the hell else we're going to talk about.
Topics. Well, I don't think we'll devote a whole nother podcast to it, but excited to see what the actual deal was.
Yeah, if we can ever get it out. PE firms are usually pretty tight-lipped, but we'll see. But all right, well, let's get out of here for this week.
Cool.